When we think about these huge philosophical revolutions, our minds usually go straight to the big names, right? Guys like René Descartes, who just completely turned the world of ideas on its head. But we often forget about another person who's just as crucial to the story, the one who actually sells the revolution. So today, we're not just talking about Descartes. We're talking about the guy who managed to market his radical, even dangerous ideas to a whole country.
And that brings up this huge question, one that's just as relevant now as it was 400 years ago. How does a truly radical idea, something that challenges everything people believe, actually break through all the noise in opposition to become, well, mainstream? The story of how Cartesian philosophy took over England is a pretty incredible case study.
All right, so let's set the scene. We're in the middle of the 17th century in England. It's a time of huge intellectual and religious upheaval. And at the center of our story is, of all people, a totally unlikely champion for a brand new and very controversial philosophy.
To get what's going on, you have to understand the context. On one side, you've got England, fiercely Protestant, intellectually dominated by this old-school scholastic philosophy, and just deeply, deeply hostile to anything Catholic. And then in 1656, who walks into this powder keg? Antoine Legrand. And he's not just a Catholic, he's a Franciscan friar on a mission. And the idea he's pushing? Cartesianism, a philosophy from a French Catholic that was seen as just as foreign and threatening as his own faith. I mean, think about what that means. Legrand wasn't just stepping into an academic squabble. He was on a mission that was genuinely dangerous. He had to convince a hostile Protestant nation to adopt the ideas of a Catholic philosopher. The personal risk he was taking was immense.
So how in the world did he do it? How does a lone friar get any traction at all for such a disruptive idea? Well, he didn't just show up and start arguing. No, he had a strategy. A brilliant one, actually.
It was basically a three-step plan. First, he repackaged the product. He knew the academics all spoke the language of scholasticism, so he presented Descartes' radical ideas using that familiar framework, making them seem less strange. Second, he published a super accessible textbook, a user-friendly manual, you could say, so that students, not just the top professors, could get into it. And third, he went on the offensive. He showed up at Oxford and Cambridge to publicly debate the biggest critics and defend the philosophy from all the attacks.
And you know what? It worked. It totally worked. The Oxford historian Anthony Wood, who was writing at the time, said that Legrand's textbook became a must-read at Cambridge, the very heart of the English intellectual world. He had essentially hacked the system from the inside out.
But here's the thing. Legrand wasn't just a marketing genius. His contribution went way deeper than that. To really make Cartesianism stick, he knew he had to do more than just sell it. He had to clarify it and shore up its weakest points.
You can almost think of him as a developer, not just a distributor. He took Descartes' core operating system, found the bugs and vulnerabilities that critics were attacking, and he patched them. He elaborated on the fuzzy parts and built stronger defenses, making the whole system just much more robust.
So what's a great example of this? Well, let's look at how he handled one of the absolute biggest puzzles in all of philosophy, one that even Descartes himself kind of struggled with, the mind-body problem. How on earth does an immaterial thing like a mind interact with a physical thing like a body?
And this right here is where you really see Legrand's talent for clarification shine. He didn't just pull a new solution out of thin air. Instead, he came up with this really powerful and intuitive analogy to explain Descartes' position in a way that nobody had managed before.
So to get his point across, he asks us to think about two types of unions we already get, right? Two different minds can be united by a non-physical principle, love. And two physical bodies? Well, they're united by physical contact. His point is simple. Each kind of union has its own unique way of being united.
So Legrand argued the mind-body union just has its own unique principle. He called it the principle of actual mutual dependence. It's basically a two-way street. The soul's thoughts depend on the body's motions, what we sense, and at the same time, the body's motions can depend on the soul's thoughts, when we decide to move our arm, for example. He called it a mutual commerce of actions and passions. It wasn't some mysterious fusion. It was a constant, functional, back-and-forth relationship.
So what was the final verdict on Legrand's campaign? Did he actually pull it off? Did Cartesianism become the new law of the land in England? The answer is really fascinating.
For a while there, his victory was, well, it was total. By the late 1600s, Cartesianism was considered the established philosophy at Cambridge. I mean, even after Isaac Newton published his world-changing Principia, it was seen as a book but for the few. Legrand's work was the mainstream. But the tide did eventually turn. By the early 1700s, Newtonian physics took over and became the new standard.
So even though it wasn't a permanent win, Legrand's legacy is absolutely undeniable. He's the guy who built the bridge that allowed Descartes' ideas to cross into England in the first place. He made it the top philosophy in English universities for a whole generation. And maybe most importantly, he left behind a masterclass on how a dedicated strategic champion can take a wild, radical idea and make it the new common sense.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, right? We're surrounded by huge, world-changing ideas today. AI, gene editing, the whole shebang. But for every famous name we know, there's probably an Antoine Legrand out there working behind the scenes, packaging, translating, and defending those ideas so the rest of us can even begin to understand them. So it makes you wonder, who are the forgotten champions shaping the big ideas of our own time?